The air inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse was thick with murmurs and quiet judgment. Every seat in the gallery was filled, spectators whispering, trading assumptions. At the center of it all stood Donald Dawson, a 20-year-old accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. He stood beside the defendant's table, hands in his pockets, shoulders squared, calm, unshaken, watching. Judge Rowan leaned back, fingers tapping against the desk, eyes sweeping over Donald as if already passing judgment. To him, this case was nothing new. Another kid, another stolen car, another guilty verdict. Across the courtroom, Darius Carrington, the prosecutor, smoothed his tie. His posture screamed confidence. This wasn't a trial. It was a routine conviction. Rowan exhaled, already bored. "Let's move this along, Mr. Carrington." Darius rose smoothly, addressing the jury with the ease of a man who had already won. "This case is simple. The defendant was caught in a stolen Audi A6. He ran from the police. He resisted arrest. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. He turned, locking eyes with Donald. And today he will face the consequences." A ripple of quiet amusement ran through the courtroom. Donald. He didn't react. He just waited. Because today he wasn't just on trial. Today he would make the system answer to him. A hush settled over the courtroom, the weight of expectation pressing down on every spectator. To them, the trial was already decided, just another name on the docket, another conviction waiting to be stamped. But Donald Dawson knew something they didn't. He wasn't here to play his assigned role. He was here to rewrite the script. Donald's court-appointed attorney had barely spoken since the trial began. She was competent, but overwhelmed. And more importantly, she wasn't the one who understood this case best. Donald did. When she shifted nervously in her seat, about to speak, he placed a steady hand on her arm. A silent request. Then he stood. "Your Honor, I will be representing myself." The words dropped into the courtroom like a stone in a still pond. The reaction was immediate. Murmurs, stolen glances, a low chuckle from someone in the back. Judge Rowan lifted a brow, amused. "Excuse me?" Donald squared his shoulders. "I will be defending myself." Rowan leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow, dry chuckle. "Son, this isn't a school debate." "I understand that, Your Honor." Rowan smirked, shaking his head. "Your funeral." Across the room, Darius Carrington folded his arms, smirking. "This should be interesting." The gallery laughed. But Donald? He didn't. Because in just a few minutes, none of them would be laughing anymore. Donald let the silence stretch, just enough to make them uncomfortable. Then he spoke. "Mr. Carrington, I have a question for you." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, still smug. "Go ahead." Donald took a step forward, slow and deliberate. "You stated that Officer Ramon personally witnessed me behind the wheel before I was arrested, correct?" Darius nodded without hesitation. "That's right." Donald tilted his head slightly. "And that testimony is written in the official report?" Darius exhaled sharply, already bored. "It is." Donald nodded. Then he turned to Judge Rowan. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss Officer Ramon's testimony as evidence." Rowan blinked. That got his attention. "On what grounds?" Donald pulled his hands from his pockets for the first time. "Because Officer Ramon wasn't even on duty when the chase began." Silence. Darius's smirk faltered, only slightly but enough. "What?" Donald took another step forward. "If the court allows, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Ramon's GPS logs from that night. If his report is accurate, it should match his location history." He let the words hang for a moment. "But I have a feeling it won't." The shift in the room was subtle, but undeniable. Rowan turned toward Darius. "Counselor?" The hesitation that followed was brief, but it was enough. The jury saw it. The gallery saw it. And most importantly, Rowan saw it. Darius cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. "No objections, Your Honor." But the damage was already done. For the first time since the trial started, the courtroom wasn't laughing. Now they were listening. Darius shuffled his papers, recovering. "Your Honor, while we wait for those GPS records, the fact remains the defendant's fingerprints were found on the stolen vehicle's steering wheel." Donald nodded slightly. "That's true." He turned to the jury, meeting their eyes one by one. "But let's talk about that for a second." Rowan gestured for him to continue. Donald took a slow, deliberate step forward. The prosecution wants you to believe that because my fingerprints were in that car, I must have stolen it. He let that thought settle. But let's think about this logically. His voice remained steady, controlled. Let's say you walk into a department store. You try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up. Then you put it back on the rack and walk out. A few hours later, someone shoplifts that jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you stole it? A few jurors exchanged glances. Donald saw it. The first crack. He didn't let them recover. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before the alleged theft. I was inside that store with 3 friends. And yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door, because it was already unlocked. His voice dropped just slightly, forcing them to lean in. I didn't take the car. I didn't drive it. I didn't steal anything. Just a dumb moment of curiosity. Then in a voice sharp as a blade, he asked, "Does touching something make you a criminal?" Another shift, another ripple through the jury. Darius flipped through his note, searching for something, anything to regain control. Donald wasn't done. "And while we're talking about evidence," Donald continued, turning to Judge Rowan, "Your Honor, was the forensic specialist who processed my fingerprints subpoenaed to testify?" Rowan blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He glanced at Darius. The prosecutor hesitated, then reluctantly, "No." Donald pressed his lips together. "So let me get this straight." He turned back to the jury, his tone measured. "The state is using forensic evidence to convict me, but they didn't bring in the actual expert who processed that evidence? No chance for me to cross-examine? No way to verify the chain of custody?" Darius had no response. Donald let the silence stretch. Then finally he looked at Judge Rowan. "Your Honor, the state's case is built on fabricated testimony, omitted evidence, and forensic claims that haven't even been defended by an expert." He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "If that's what we call justice, I don't want to know what injustice looks like." Judge Rowan exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. This case was supposed to be simple. Now it was anything but. And Donald? He had just forced the entire courtroom to rethink everything. The courtroom had transformed. What had started as a routine trial had become something far more unsettling. Judge Rowan was no longer bored. Darius Carrington was no longer smug. And Donald Dawson? He was no longer just the defendant. He was the one in control. Donald let the silence settle, then reached into the documents he had been carefully reviewing. He pulled out a printed page and held it up. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the stolen vehicle." Rowan's brow furrowed. "The owner?" "Yes, Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the Audi A6 in question." Darius stiffened. Donald took a step forward. "Mr. Whitaker provided a statement to the police the night his car was reported stolen, but somehow that statement was never included in the prosecution's filings." Rowan's gaze flickered toward Darius, who remained silent. Donald cleared his throat and read aloud. "I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off, but it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the gallery. Rowan leaned forward, gripping his gavel tightly. "Is this accurate, Mr. Carrington?" Darius hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "Your Honor, the defendant was found near the abandoned vehicle. That remains suspicious?" Donald shook his head. "It's convenient." His voice cut through the air like a blade. "The real suspect got away. Instead of looking for him, the officers found a black teenager nearby and decided that was close enough." The tension in the courtroom was palpable. For the first time, the jury wasn't just listening to Donald. They were questioning everything. A side door creaked open, and a court clerk entered, holding a printed document. The room held its breath. The clerk walked straight to Judge Rowan, handed him the page, and stepped back. Rowan scanned the document, his fingers clenched slightly around the paper. Then he looked up. "The GPS records for Officer Ramon have been reviewed." He turned his gaze toward Darius, his voice sharper now. "The officer was not at the scene of the theft when he claimed to have witnessed Mr. Dawson in the vehicle." The gallery exploded in murmurs. Darius remained frozen, his polished exterior beginning to crack. Donald? He simply exhaled, not in relief, but in quiet satisfaction, because he had known the truth all along. He turned to the jury. So now we have a fabricated testimony and missing evidence. Tell me, does this still sound like an airtight case to you? The question hung in the air like a storm cloud. The jury members shifted, their expressions no longer neutral. Darius scrambled to regain control. Your Honor, despite these discrepancies, the fact remains the defendant's fingerprints were found inside the stolen car. Donald nodded. That's true. He turned back to Rowan. But let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was conducted. Donald took another step forward, his voice even but firm. Your Honor, was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify? Rowan blinked, caught off guard by the question. He glanced at Darius. The prosecutor hesitated. Then, reluctantly, no. Donald let that hang in the air. So let me get this straight. He turned to the jury, his voice steady. The state is using forensic evidence to convict me, but they didn't bring in the expert who processed that evidence? No chance for me to cross-examine? No way to verify accuracy? Darius had no response. Donald took a slow breath. Then he turned back to Judge Rowan. Your Honor, at this point, the state's case is built on a false witness statement, omitted evidence, and forensic claims that haven't even been defended by an expert. A pause, then, with quiet finality. If this is what we call justice, I don't want to know what injustice looks like. Rowan let out a long exhale, rubbing his temple. This case was supposed to be simple. Now, it had become a reflection of something much bigger, a broken system. And Donald Dawson? He was the one who had forced them to see it. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The weight of what had just transpired hung over everyone like a storm about to break. Judge Rowan exhaled slowly, gripping the gavel in his hand. But for the first time today, he wasn't sure what to do with it. The case that had seemed open and shut had just unraveled before his very eyes. Not because of a high-priced lawyer, not because of a technicality, but because the defendant had forced the truth into the open. And now that truth was staring everyone in the face. Judge Rowan looked at Darius Carrington, whose usual confidence had been stripped away. Counselor, do you have anything further? Darius's lips pressed into a thin line. He wanted to argue, wanted to salvage what remained of his case, but there was nothing left. No, Your Honor. Rowan nodded. Then he turned to Donald Dawson. For the first time, there was no condescension in his gaze, no dismissive amusement, only acknowledgement. Rowan tapped his gavel lightly against the desk. Case dismissed. For a moment, no one reacted. Then chaos. The gallery erupted, some in relief, some in frustration. The low hum of murmurs exploded into hushed conversations, reporters scrambling to scribble notes. Donald stood motionless, watching as everything unfolded. This wasn't victory. This was justice finally taking its first breath. The moment Donald stepped outside, the world descended upon him. Camera flashes lit up the courthouse steps. Reporters swarmed him, their voices overlapping. Donald, how do you feel after today's verdict? Did you expect to win? Do you think the system failed you? Are you considering law school? Donald ignored them all. He wasn't interested in their spectacle. This wasn't about making headlines. It was about something bigger. He pulled his hoodie over his head and took the first step down the courthouse stairs. Then a voice called out, "Boy, you nearly gave me a heart attack." Donald turned. Standing at the bottom of the steps was his mother, Denise Dawson. Her arms were crossed, but her face, a mixture of exhaustion and pride. Donald chuckled, scratching the back of his head. Had to take a risk, Ma. She let out a breath, shaking her head before pulling him into a tight hug. You always were the stubborn one. Donald didn't say anything. He didn't need to. For the first time in weeks, he finally felt like he could breathe. From the other side of the street, Judge Rowan watched the scene unfold. His usual detached posture was gone. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest, his expression unreadable. He had walked into that courtroom believing this was just another day, another case, another guilty verdict. And yet, he had been forced to stop and reconsider everything. How many times had he sentenced a defendant who didn't have the ability to fight back? How many cases had been pushed through the system, not based on facts but assumptions. How many Donald Dawsons never had their voices heard? For the first time in a long time, Judge Rowan felt uncertain, and that bothered him more than anything else. As Donald and his mother walked away from the courthouse, Denise glanced at him. "So what now?" Donald shoved his hands into his pockets, considering the question. For years he had studied the law not because he wanted to become a lawyer, but because he had no choice. He had learned how the system worked to survive it. But now he realized this wasn't just his fight. It was bigger than him, bigger than this case, and it wasn't over. Donald glanced back at the courthouse one last time, the place where they had tried to write his fate for him, where he had written his own instead. His lips curved into a smirk as he turned back toward the street ahead. "We'll see, Ma." And with that, he walked forward, because this wasn't the last courtroom he would stand in. Next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the one fighting for someone else. As Donald walked away from the courthouse, the echoes of his case still lingered in the air. This wasn't just a personal victory, it was a message, a warning to the system, because for every Donald Dawson who knew how to fight back, there were countless others who didn't. How many had been convicted not because they were guilty, but because they lacked the resources to prove their innocence? How many had accepted plea deals out of fear, even when they had done nothing wrong? How many had been victims of assumptions, of bias, of a system that thrived on speed rather than fairness? Judge Rowan had felt it. Darius Carrington had been forced to acknowledge it. And Donald? He had done more than clear his name. He had made the system look at itself. Justice isn't just about trials, evidence, or verdicts. It's about the people who dare to question them. For too long, the system had functioned on certainty, on routine, on assumptions that rarely got challenged. Donald had changed that, not with money, not with connections, not with power, with knowledge, with persistence, with the refusal to be silenced. And if he could do it, how many others could too, if they just knew how? This case wasn't just about a stolen car. It was about what happens when people stop asking questions, about how easy it is to convict someone when no one bothers to look deeper, and about what it takes to break that cycle. Donald had been one person, but he had forced an entire courtroom to listen, to reconsider, to question, and maybe, just maybe, to change. Donald had a choice now. He could walk away, leave the courthouse behind, let the system continue as it always had, or he could become part of the change. Because this wouldn't be the last courtroom he stood in, and next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the one standing up for someone else. Because if there's one thing this case had proven, the system only changes when you make it. Justice isn't just about laws, it's about those who dare to question them. Life teaches us that silence allows injustice to thrive, but knowledge gives us the power to challenge it. Too often, people accept what they're told, believing they have no choice. But the truth is, you always have a choice. You can accept the system as it is, or you can stand up, demand answers, and refuse to be dismissed. Change doesn't happen because it's fair. It happens because someone forces it to. So ask questions. Seek the truth, because the moment you stop accepting, the world starts changing.